So this series of talks is on the constitutions and statutes of the Cistercian Order of the Strict Observance. It's, strictly speaking, a subjective history. Because of my involvement in it, I want to talk about how I experienced the formation of this legal document. First of all, however, I'd like just to say a little bit about what are constitutions and to clarify our own understanding of them. A constitution, in the singular, is usually considered as a body of fundamental law, defining the relationship of the state to its citizens and their rights. It's a summary of political philosophy, a social contract. It gives the outlines of what the people in this political entity believe, what their values are, and what they wish to preserve. It's a statement of basic principles of governance which cannot be changed except by extraordinary procedures. Often that involves a referendum, which all the people have to agree. That's constitution in the singular. Constitutions in the plural is borrowed from Roman law, in which the term referred to anything that was established as binding, something that an authoritative body set down and constituted as being the way things are done, whether this is by law or by custom or judgment or contract, as Quintilian said. An imperial constitution is a decree that comes from the emperor. We don't have to worry much about that these days. Canon law follows Roman usage. Constitutions of religious orders are collections of bylaws considered to come from the highest source. That is, that they must be approved and imposed by the Holy See, even though they are composed by the religious orders themselves. What is submitted is subject to correction and emendation before being approved. And in point of fact, the Vatican bodies love to put their fingerprints, their dirty fingerprints, all over whatever is sent to them, just to show who's in charge of the whole thing and who knows best what's good for people. So when we're talking about the constitutions of our constitutions, we're talking about something that was decided by the General Chapter, a text that was decided by the General Chapter, which it gives in great detail an outline and prescriptions for the way of life, and which is then submitted to the Roman authorities, who put it in a drawer and 6 months later come back and have a look at it and correct the grammar, add a few commas, change a few words, and then send it back. That's what our constitutions are. But there's a further complication in that there are two types of law. There are constitutions and there are statutes. Constitutions are a concise statement of the key elements of the way of life pursued by each institute. They cannot be changed without the intervention of the Holy See. And to this degree, once submitted and approved, they pass beyond the competence even of general chapters. Statutes, on the other hand, are different. They're a secondary level of legislation that supports, extends, and interprets the constitutions, but which remains under the authority of the institute itself. And in fact, in the old days, the constitutions were fairly stereotyped, and the most specific parts of legislation were what was contained in the statutes. This is the directory, or the collection of statutes. So constitutions are the basic framework of legislation, which must be approved by the Holy See. Statutes can be changed by general chapters. An institute's law is thus made up of constitutions and statutes. Both are equally obligatory as far as the members are concerned. You can't say, oh, it's only a statute, I don't need to bother about that, I follow the constitutions, the statutes I don't worry about. Or maybe later when I become more perfect, I'll start to include the statutes in my code of conduct. No, they're equally obligatory, but statutes can be modified by each institute on its own authority. And so part of the purpose of constitutions and statutes is that they give some sort of identity. If you read our constitutions, you'll know that we're not Salesians, we're not Benedictines, we're not Carthusians, because our constitutions are different. They describe a way of life that is particular and specific to us, and is not necessarily lived by any other institute in the Church. In principle, constitutions are submitted to the Holy See when a group seeks recognition as a religious institute or when new constitutions are drawn up. They're generated, they come from within the institute itself, but they only become constitutions when they're approved. Once approval is obtained, constitutions become a source of identity, continuity, and consensus. We are the people who follow this particular body of legislation. We incarnate it in our way of life. And it also offers continuity because it can't be changed overnight, because you don't get a change of Abbot General who says, oh, I don't like this and I don't like that and I don't like the other thing. But on the contrary, it's something that is quite difficult to change. And so it offers the possibility of some sense of continuity on the important beliefs and values and practices of a particular order. And, of course, it provides a basis for consensus, that we all agree that the constitutions are binding on us all. In general, constitutions are to be considered as a quasi-permanent statement of the nature and purpose of each institute, universal enough to be valid in different cultures and situations, yet sufficiently particular to encapsulate the charism and spirit proper to each religious family. So that universality is an important component of constitutions, that they can't simply represent the situation in Europe or the United States or Africa, but they must be something that is valid in all those situations, valid in all the different styles of monastic life that the order incorporates. Constitutions describe what the order is, what the order does, and most particularly how it is governed. Well, that's all I'm going to say about the nature of constitutions, just to get it clear, just to get it out of the system, as it were. Let's now look at where our constitutions come from, the historical trajectory, you might say. Well, we go back a long time. And the basis of the constitutions is the rule of St. Benedict. And as we'll see later on, that there are many people in the order who wanted to include the rule of Benedict in our constitutions and to have the additions as no more than declarations based on the rule. For various reasons, this never came about. But the fact remains that the basis of all our law in the order is the rule of St. Benedict. At first, there was competition between the rule of St. Benedict and the rule of Columban. And after the 9th century Council of Aachen, the rule of Benedict became the primary juridical document governing the regimen of monasteries in the West. Before then, until imposed by imperial edict, its authority was largely moral rather than juridical, which meant that monks used it when they wanted to. They got bits and pieces out of it, they left bits out, they added bits to it, and basically to make sure that they did what every monk and every nun wants to do, is to do what they wanted. After the Council of Aachen, things changed, and the rule of St. Benedict in its integrity, and as it was then understood, was imposed on all the monasteries of the West. So it became the basic juridical document that has framed, you might say, the unfolding of monasticism in the Western Church. In practical terms, it was supplemented by various books of customaries, which interpreted the rule for local conditions. And practically, these came to replace the rule because they defined the details of daily life, sometimes with great particularity. So you'd have a particular customary for a single monastery. And they talk about going through the back door into here and doing that, and everything was very local and very particular, and that was very useful. But in time, the books of customs became far more important than the rule itself. If you want to know what to do, look at the books of customs. The rule itself slunk back into the dark recesses of the background. It was still read daily, it was still commented on it intermittently, but the practical details of life were derived from books of customs. And meanwhile, abbatial governance became more and more monarchical, especially where large land holdings gave the abbots a great deal of temporal power. And the obvious example here is Cluny, Gauze also, but the abbot was more or less a lord in his own right. He had spiritual jurisdiction, it's true, but mostly he was concerned with the overall governance of the monastery. And the bigger the monasteries became, the more they departed from actual coherence with the principles of St. Benedict's rule. In more recent times, some institutes have attempted to confect constitutions by adding declarations to the chapters of the rule of Benedict, but the result has usually been both artificial and confusing, in my opinion, my humble opinion. So the first source of our constitutions is the rule of St. Benedict. And then we have the primitive Cistercian documents. The founding of the new monastery and the formation of its foundations into a single lifestyle-oriented unit, an ordo, has left a paper trail that makes possible a general idea of how the law of the order has evolved. The documents submitted to Calixtus II for approval in 1119 included a narrative describing how and why the order was established, the narrative, the Exordium Parvum, a succinct account of the signature observances, the Instituta, and a charter detailing the internal governance of the order, the Carta Caritatis. And these three components are still essential in submitting documentation for the founding of new order. There must be a narrative to say why it's established, how it was established, and what its particular characteristics are, what makes it different from other institutes, and what are its signature observances, and how is it governed. And these documents underwent development for at least 30 years, and that gives the scholars great cause for dispute about which is authentic, why things changed, and so forth. It's, however, an important point is that, as far as I can tell from the very beginning, the order had a flexibility about it, an openness to change, a recognition that changing circumstances require a different response and may require a change in even what seems to be the basic documents. So the Carta Caritatis Prior is one thing, the Carta Caritatis Posterior, the later one, reflects the change in the order with the multiplication of houses which were no longer assembled quite as tightly around the Cito. By the 1170s, the observances were codified. You had a book of customs in the Ecclesiastica Officia for the choir monks and the Usus Conversorum for the lay brothers. The exact dating of these and the number of editions they went through is, of course, subject to scholarly dispute. So it doesn't really matter, but the fact of the matter is that there was a movement towards codifying the way of life that had emerged so it could be handed on to future generations. And what is quite distinct in our order is the supplementary legislation provided by the statutes issued by the general chapters. In other words, setting up a general chapter with the power to pass statutes recognized that the future was likely to require changes not only in law, but also that judgments were to be made. It had a juridical aspect, and also it had an executive aspect. It had to make decisions about new situations that came up. And we don't realize, perhaps, what a substantial body of history that we have in the statutes of the general chapters. From the 12th century to the French Revolution, which effectively brought the order to an end in one sense, there were 365 general chapters. And the number of statutes passed, published by Canivet, amounts to about 4,000 pages. So if you want an idea of what was happening in monasteries between the 12th century and the French Revolution, all you have to do is to work your way through Canivet's. If you don't want to do that, you could read an article that I wrote that was published in Analecta Cisterciensia, which gives an outline of some of the things. And let me warn you that not all of the things that happened in those several hundred years were absolutely edifying. In fact, just about every kind of moral defect that is imaginable, at least by an innocent soul like me, will be found commented on and mentioned in the statutes of the general chapter. But the important thing, it seems to me, is that from the very beginning it was recognized that legislation had to develop to suit the changing circumstances. And you don't have to know very much about European history to know what some of those circumstances were. There was the Black Death to begin with, the change from the warm climate, the warm medieval period, to the Little Ice Age. And there were plagues of various sorts. There was the Reformation, there were religious wars, there were civil disputes, the 100 Years' War. Cîteaux itself was ransacked and looted 4 times. Most of our monasteries haven't endured anything like that. The pandemic was nothing compared with the Black Death. About half the monastic populations perished in the Black Death. So what the wisdom of the founders, and I find it absolutely astonishing, in that monarchical age, that they first of all entrusted the major legislation not to a person but to the general chapter. It's not quite an example of synodality, but is moving in that direction. And even between sessions, it preferred the 4 proto-abbots to operate rather than simply the abbot of Cîteaux. So it's an extraordinary departure from what might be expected. And then the way they got down to meeting even in very difficult times. Travel, there was no problem with changing time zones in the 12th century. You did about 20 or 30 kilometres a day on horseback, and that was it. And if you were coming from Hungary to a general chapter, it took half a year just about for a few days of meeting. So that's the second aspect of our constitutions, is that they derive from this tradition of making provision for the constant renewal and updating of our way of life to accord with the reality of the situation as it really is. The other thing about our order is that it has always been a self-reforming order. This tendency to want to incorporate changes to legislation to suit the circumstances meant that the order was always being reformed. Notice that, with a hyphen. Not just reformed, overcoming deformation, but constantly being reformed. And that's the mandate that I think we all have as members of the orders, but particularly those that have the right to control the flow of events. But unfortunately, it's one that is often resisted because people don't want to change. They don't want to reform. They want to leave things as they are. So the first attempt at reform was in 1265. Some of you are old enough to remember that. Parvus Fons, issued by Clement IV, subsequently called the Clementina. Less than a century later, Benedict XII, who was himself a Cistercian, wrote his charter of reform, Fulgens sicut stella matutina, which is called the Benedictina. In 1563, very important was the Council of Trent, De Regularibus et Monialibus, on regulars, on religious and nuns. And I have to say the order's response to that was very, very serious. The 4 proto-abbots went around on a tour of the whole order, bringing them the news of what the council had decreed and trying to convince people. And look at the date there, 1563, not exactly the golden age of the church, trying to convince people to pull up their socks and to conform with it. It really was a very, very faithful, I suppose, and intense effort to get the order to listen to the appeal of the council to reform its ways, insofar as that was relevant. Then there were a series of general chapters, plenary general chapters. Because of distance, not all general chapters were plenary. You're allowed to skip them occasionally. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, probably the unlucky number. General chapters trying to implement the decrees of the council, which means that it kept on going for nearly a century, trying to upgrade things and to recognise that attention was needed, that there were problems there that needed to be recognised and needed to be faced. It's an astonishing thing, really, just how concerned the order was at self-reforming its whole history. 1601, in the middle of that, Edmund de la Croix, the abbot of Citeaux, attempted a systematic reform. And as you can imagine, it fell flat on its face. You try and get the majority of people to approve something which involves them pulling up their socks, and you haven't got a hope in heaven. Huh? So that failed. 3 years later, the abbot of Clairvaux, Denis Le Chantier, produced a charter for reform, and he had a large number of abbots who supported him, but still failed to get any majority in the general chapter. And in the general chapter of 1605 refused to confirm the Charter of Reform. They wanted things left as they are. And so this gave rise to a movement that was called the Strict Observance. And we'll learn more about this later.
When I call, answer me.